Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Eleonora Villegas Reimers, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel of experts today. I am a faculty member at Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, and I'm currently serving as the chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning. Today's event is a part of a series aimed at raising awareness around the imperative and opportunity of diversifying our educator workforce. At an event yesterday, participants heard researchers and policymakers make the case for investment and action around a more representative workforce. Today, we're going to dive a bit deeper into one piece of the puzzle in actualizing this vision as we focus on the teacher pipeline. I'm joined today by researchers who will start our event by sharing the data and insights around the teacher pipeline in Massachusetts. This will be followed by a discussion with two educators who will share their own experience entering the workforce and working to help others do the same. We welcome questions and answers throughout the discussion. You can see the question and answer icon. Feel free to type your questions anytime in your screen. We will get to as many of those questions as we can. So let me first introduce Ms. Melanie Rucinski, a doctoral candidate at the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. Her current work focuses on understanding how the structure of school systems contributes to inequality in education and the labor market. In prior work, she has studied barriers to racial diversity in exam schools in Boston and the teacher pipeline in Massachusetts. Before starting her PhD, Melanie worked as a research assistant at the Kennedy School and at the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research. Melanie?
Hi, thanks, Eleonora, and thank you so much for having me. I'll take a second and share my screen. So I'm going to present today on some joint work with Josh Goodman, who, as you all know, is a faculty member here at Boston University. So we are all here today because we know that students benefit on multiple dimensions from having teachers of the same race. Yet despite this, that US teachers are disproportionately white. And we also know that there are racial gaps at sort of each stage of the teacher pipeline in the United States. So we see racial gaps in college graduation, in certification test scores and other academic requirements for teaching, and in teacher employment and retention. But what we don't know, or what we've had a somewhat weaker understanding of until recently, is how important each of these gaps actually is in the overall lack of diversity among teachers. And that's because we typically observe these gaps in the cross section, but aren't actually able to observe teachers going through the pipeline and seeing where candidates of color are dropping out of the pipeline at higher rates than white teaching candidates. So in this work, what we've done is actually track teaching candidates in Massachusetts who take the certification test in the state through multiple stages of the pipeline. So we can observe whether individual people are taking and passing the required communications and literacy licensure test, which is required of all teachers in Massachusetts, whether teachers get a license in Massachusetts, whether they end up teaching in Massachusetts public schools, and whether they are retained in Massachusetts public schools for at least 3 years. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And our primary research question of interest is going to be how much each stage of the teacher pipeline contributes to low diversity in the Massachusetts teacher workforce. So jumping right into our results, the first thing that we see is that people who are taking this CommLit test in Massachusetts are much less diverse than college enrollees in the state. So while college students in the state are about 2/3 white, and they actually look pretty similar to K-12 students in the state. Once we get to the point of taking the certification test, teaching candidates are about 87% white. So right off the bat, we're just losing a lot of diversity at the point where college students are deciding whether they want to become teachers. Then we also see that the largest gaps in persistence are in the early stages of the pipeline. So we see pretty substantial racial gaps in the likelihood that candidates are passing the CommLit test and the likelihood that they're earning a license. But once we get out to the point of being hired as a teacher or being retained in Massachusetts public schools, we actually see the racial gap starting to shrink. And this is something a little bit different from what we've seen in other settings where there are more substantial racial gaps in hiring and retention. So we still see some gaps there, but they're not as large as the gaps that are early on in the pipeline. We also find that these gaps are going to persist when we compare teachers with similar performance the first time they take the COMLET test. So although we do see some racial gaps in performance on the COMLET test, we also see that this isn't just a story about candidates of color performing worse on that test, that even if they perform equally well as white candidates, there are still gaps in the likelihood that they're persisting kind of to the end of the pipeline. So why is this happening? We can't tell a complete story about mechanisms, but we do see a few things. So one is that Black, Hispanic, and Asian COMLET takers are less likely to retake the COMLET test if they fail the first time. So even though retaking is an option that's available to these candidates, whether it's because of time or financial or informational barriers, we see that candidates of color are less likely to retake the test, and that's part of why they're not as likely to get a license as white candidates. We also see that candidates of color are less likely than white candidates to pass other tests that are required for licensure in the state. So again, that could be due to any number of barriers, but the fact that candidates of color aren't passing these other tests is contributing to their lack of getting a license and ultimate lower rates of hiring. So just to wrap up, we see that there are gaps on the teacher pipeline that suggest some potential opportunities for improvement. So we could improve diversity in the teacher workforce in Massachusetts if we were able to close this gap in passing the COMLET, and if we were able to close this gap in licensure. However, I think the kind of big, really most important finding of this work is that even if we were able to close those gaps among people who have sort of expressed interest in teaching by taking this test, we would still be left with a teaching workforce that's over 80% white. And that's just coming from that 87% of test takers who are white to begin with. That's sort of the best we can do by closing these gaps later in the pipeline. And so that means that I think this is something that was also mentioned yesterday. If we really want to substantially improve the diversity of the teacher workforce in the long run, we really have to focus on recruiting college students of color into teaching and closing educational attainment gaps earlier in the pipeline that are preventing students of color from ultimately becoming teachers. So I will end here, but thank you again for having me. I'm always happy to take questions and talk about this work over email, and I'll turn it back over to Eleonora.
Thank you, Melanie. This was really interesting, and I look forward to the conversation that will follow now, but thank you so much for that quick presentation. It is my pleasure now to introduce two educators who will share their reaction to the research findings. They are Dr. Sana Sheikh and Ms. Atira Horn. Dr. Sheikh is a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Manager at Curriculum Associates. She is also the founder of her consulting company, Time Ed, taking initiative, making equity in education. Previously, she was at Springfield Public Schools, where she was the director of school operations, and also worked for Voices for Children as the director of the College and Career Readiness Alliance. She has held several roles within Teach for America and began her career as an 11th grade English teacher in Baltimore City. She holds 2 bachelors from the University of California, Berkeley in Policy Science and Near Eastern Studies, a master's from Johns Hopkins in Urban Studies, a master's from Brandeis in Social Policy, and her PhD is in Organizational Theory and Behavior from the Heller School of Social Policy and Management. Ms. Atira Horn has been a middle school counselor for 5 consecutive years in the Randolph Public Schools here in Massachusetts, and does so with have a passion for supporting and empowering young people to reach their academic and personal goals. Atira was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, received her bachelor's in sociology from Elms College, and graduated from Boston College in 2016 with a master's in counseling psychology with a concentration in school counseling. So I turn my attention to both of them, and I think that we will begin with Dr. Sheikh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleonora, and thank you so much, Melanie. That was really poignant research. I think that in terms of my responses, I would bucket them into twofold. I think that in terms of the findings of how people of color and teachers of color are just not really taking the test here in Massachusetts illuminates the need for making the test much more achievable and attainable to them. There must be some sort of barriers of entry that your research really illuminates that I would be very interested and curious to hear about. I think oftentimes with data and research, it shows really poignant illuminations, but my question always goes to why? Like, why is that the reason? Because if we're starting off with such a dearth of people of color or teachers of color even taking the test, the likelihood of them staying in the pipeline and staying for a long period of time and the challenges that go along with it can even be more damaging to having students have teachers look like them. I know that you named that over 80% of teachers are white, which I just think is not really the statistics we want to see when the majority of students that teachers do teach in spaces are Black and brown, and there isn't an alignment there. The second way of me kind of compartmentalizing and answering the question is just kind of discussing a little bit about my experience navigating the system, both as someone who took the test, as well as someone who was credentialed and ultimately taught. And I think that in every single piece of this puzzle, it is a bit jarring to not have folks look like you throughout the entire journey. And I think that affects you in different ways. The research is powerful in the sense that it illuminates the journey, right? Like, where are the barriers of entry and how has the progression occurred over the last several years of a teacher trying to get in the classroom. But there is really something to be said about emotional labor and consistently being in spaces where you're not the majority, and there's cultural norms and mores which make it so like the whiteness is the standard for effectiveness. And so I would be really curious to see like how this data illuminates more findings in the future about emotional labor that goes into not being part of the system, not having the system be something that was developed for you as someone who is of color or who has a quote unquote an ethnic name, and how that person or people respond to it and the resilience that they have to continue being teachers. And so Atira and I are part of the Inspired Fellows. We work in tandem to create spaces of solidarity and affinity for teachers of color so they stay within the pipeline. And these are a lot of the conversations, questions we've had as educators as to how difficult the process and project really is and how resilient teachers of color are to consistently being a high mark of education and teaching, despite all these barriers against them. And I'll defer to Atira, as she probably has a lot of powerful anecdotes to say as well.
Thank you. I definitely appreciate this opportunity to be here. And like Eleonora has mentioned, I am a school guidance counselor. So being an Inspired Fellow, it's been great to really recruit and retain educators of color in the teacher workforce, because we do know the data is that 80% of teachers are white, and that the students are over 50% of color. So I believe that the data research is extremely valuable because it really does provide numbers of what are areas that we can improve. So I think that building community for educators of color and letting them know that there is a safe space for them to network with other educators. The Inspired Fellowship has a large network of all different kinds of educators, from social workers, from guidance counselors, from academic teachers, and being able to really directly connect prospective educators of color with current professionals in the workforce who have their own, experience of struggling to pass the MTELs, of that same barrier that they are then facing, and then providing real substantial resources of what ways can we help you, which component of the test are you struggling with, which ones have you passed, and in some cases actually getting, financial assistance with helping them pay for the exams, which can be a barrier for people, but you don't necessarily know that unless you really know the individuals who are struggling to pass the exam. So I think for my experience, it's really critical to empower prospective educators of color who continuously kind of struggle in battle and may not kind of receive that support, but providing that mentorship for them so that we can connect them with people that we know who have those similar experiences so that they can not only enter into the workforce, but also stay in the workforce. And a lot of times people are not staying in, it's because they do lack that support. And they may lack that support physically at the school they are at, but let's say we may know a fellow who is in a particular role, they have someone else to turn to for guidance, so that they can maintain their position and then help someone else get in there. As an educator of color, I think it's very important and pivotal to help the next generation to attain those leadership roles, so they can help the next group. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We have now a few minutes for question and answers from the audience. I'm sorry that I have not started my video. So we now have a few minutes for question and answers for this from the audience. And for these few minutes, we are also joined by Dr. Josh Goodman, who is an associate professor of education and economics at Boston University, where he works as an applied microeconomist on labor economics and education policy. Prior to joining BU, Dr. Goodman was an associate professor of economics at Brandeis University, and before that, an associate professor of public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He started his career as a public high school math teacher in Watertown, Massachusetts. So now I welcome Josh and I welcome Atira and Dr. Sheikh to either comment on one another, and also let me check if we have any questions from the audience. We welcome all kinds of questions that you may have at this time.
As Eleonora gets questions, I would love to jump in, because there was a point that Atira said that really resonated. And that was, if you don't ask, how will you know? And the power of data and research is it gives you one piece of the larger puzzle. And so much of the data lives in the lived experiences of folks who are on the ground. I think we can all name this last year plus has been tremendously strenuous, and really like unprecedented was like the word of the year in terms of what educators had to do to really just survive. And so if we even look at the data from this year and how it's affected which folks want to be in the pipeline and become educators, like the data is going to look very different. So asking folks on the ground, like what their experience has been, what types of infrastructure and supports we can do and give is really powerful, because it gives you a vantage point of what is normal or normed for us. For so many of us, like having a working Wi-Fi, going to a panelist, learning more, that may not necessarily be in the cards. So Atira, that was a really great point that I wanted to illuminate again.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in and say that's a fantastic set of points, and I'm going to make a plug for two of my colleagues here, Andrew Bacher Hicks and Olivia Chi at BU Wheelock, who are actually working with the state of Massachusetts to answer almost exactly the question that you just posed, Sana, about how this past year has changed who is in the teacher workforce and how that's going to look over the next couple of years. So hopefully we'll have some hard data soon on how the stress of this past year has changed the situation on the ground, and will over the next couple of years. As someone who has 3 kids in public schools in Cambridge, I've seen how hard our teachers have been working in a rough year. I'll also say, I think both you and Atira made great points that, I think the work that Melanie and I did for me was really illuminating, because it made me realize that in some sense, the bulk of Massachusetts challenge lies at the beginning of the pipeline, which is a very important thing to realize. We want more candidates of color to sort of start out on that path. It's not that we're losing so many of them, excuse me, in the middle of the path, but at the beginning. But the question of why don't we have more candidates of color taking the MTELs or starting on that path is one that feels to me like it would benefit a lot from the kind of sort of qualitative research, which is a little different from the kind of work that we did. We sort of, we documented what the numbers look like, but then going to potential high school students or college students of color and saying, are you thinking about teaching as a career? If not, what are your concerns? Is it about financial constraints? Or is it about the MTEL? Is it about the fact that there's no one in your family or your narrow sort of social circles that you can use as a role model to follow this career? I think that would be immensely valuable work. And maybe it's been done, but I'd love to see some follow-up work in that way.
Thank you, Josh. There is a question in the question and answer. Let me read it for you. What can we learn from other states? Has anybody or anyone identified similar gaps elsewhere and acted on closing them? Do any of you know about that?
So I can try to answer that. I think those type of longitudinal research where we're actually able to follow individuals through the pipeline is pretty rare. Although some of the folks you might expect, like Seth Gershenson, I think is also working on a little bit of this stuff, like trying to see if we see similar patterns in other states. One thing we definitely do know is that the racial gaps in hiring and retention in Massachusetts are smaller than I think what we've seen in other places. And they are still there, certainly. And I think that there can also be both good and bad reasons why those gaps might be smaller if it has to do with, for example, like external opportunities in the labor market that are more available to some teachers than others. And so I think digging into that more and also thinking about, of course, acting on closing them. I don't know if I have seen anywhere that's been particularly successful in acting on closing these gaps so far. I think that is partially because, as we have heard today, these are such entrenched systemic problems that it's hard to close them immediately. But if anybody else knows of anything, I would certainly be interested to hear it.
Yeah, I'll just echo, I completely agree with Melanie. I think we're at a sort of early stage of having the data system set up to really watch people from the start to the finish of the pipeline, to become, starting the certification process, getting all the way to becoming a teacher. And as Melanie said, in other states where we do have this data, like Tennessee, we don't necessarily see the same patterns as there are in Massachusetts. That's one of the reasons it was sort of interesting to do this work here. As Melanie said, in Massachusetts, the problem starts at the beginning of the pipeline. Once someone is in the pipeline, sort of retention rates and development rates for candidates of color and white candidates seem fairly similar. That's not the case in, for example, Tennessee, where there was a bigger problem, I think, on the later stage of the sort of hiring and retention part of things. So in some ways, that gives me a little bit of hope for Massachusetts, which is to say, for those candidates of color who start the pipeline, given that they're sort of finishing it at similar rates as white candidates, it feels like at least that's one set of problems that we don't have. So that's maybe a mildly optimistic spin on things. So if we could get more people in at the front end, maybe we could actually make some progress on solving these problems. But I agree, we're in early days in terms of evidence about how to solve the challenge.
I would love to do a plug here about how, in terms of like the cautious optimism, Josh, like that really resonates because that many ways has been the mantra of this year, right? Can't get too excited, but gotta take the wins as you get them. And in terms of like the work that Massachusetts is doing, I do want to name, like, the Inspired Fellowship was really powerful. It was one of the very few times where I've been in an affinity space with folks who look like me, but also have similar experiences, are also educators. So as we think about innovative spaces, really acknowledging and validating folks' dignity and acknowledging and validating their story, there isn't anything more powerful than doing that. And trying to think of scale and how sustainable that type of process can be. Because I know there's been a lot of cutting edge research and innovation on what it looks like to really diversify the educator workforce. I know in varying capacities, it has been kind of the sexier topic over the last 2 or 3 decades, but trying to think of like bite-sized way of making that into a reality. I really do feel like that type of solidarity and collectivism that we had this past year, even in a remote setting, was really powerful.
Let me ask you a question of my own. One is, and I usually tend to think about of the pipeline in 2 ways. One is, where are we recruiting from? And what are we doing at the high school level to try to make teaching as a profession much more attractive? And I wonder if any of you can comment on that. But the other one is, what is the role that those of us who are teacher educators, and think about your own experience when you were getting prepared as a teacher, the kind of people who help you get prepared as teachers. What can we do to be more supportive of the experience that students of color, candidates of color have when they are in our programs, and why, any hypotheses and ideas about why they don't, particularly students of color, do not persist in the same way as white students when they begin to fail in courses or in the exam, in the MTEL or any other test that they need to take. So I don't know who wants to take that, and I know that it's a large question for the minutes that we have, but anybody who wants to address either one of those.
Yes, I would say in terms of preparing for the MTELs, I do think that, every undergraduate institution is different. So for instance, not all undergraduate institutions will allow you to graduate with education as your major if you do not pass the MTELs. So I think that is one thing that, impacts a lot of people, especially people who may be passionate about entering education, who, wanted to be a teacher for all their life, but may be struggling to pass the MTELs and unfortunately cannot get a bachelor's degree in education at their current school because they have been unable to pass the MTELs. And so usually, they'll work with their academic advisor, but I think it's very pivotal to develop a study group and to have, other individuals who, may understand the information and others who are struggling, but to have like that network of support so that you can study, so that you can be prepared. In some, grad programs, you are provided with a little bit more support. You are kind of, given more up-to-date information about, when the MTELs will take place, what are ways that you can prepare ahead of time. But I think to get started earlier, we're gonna have to do more preparation on the undergrad level so that people will know the expectations. They'll know the number of MTELs they'll have to pass, when they'll have to pass them in order to graduate with their degree in education.
Eleanor, I really appreciate your question. I think it's a really beautiful one because it just shows the scope of how complex this problem is, right? And one of the things that I've given a lot of thought to over the years has just been like the profession of educating the next generation of folks is just not considered powerful enough, unfortunately. I feel like this year has really shown it. And as like parents and educators, we know that there is really no harder job, but oftentimes like on a very like informal level, educators are not given the value that they really deserve, whether that is social currency wise or whether that is monetarily. And so when I think through one of the reasons I was like thinking about Melanie and Josh's research, like why is there a problem at the very beginning? In a place like Massachusetts, where there's so many cosmopolitan cities, and there's a likelihood of graduates making extensive money in different fields, like what would be the push then to go into education, right? When there's so many different connections, you can have a warm connection to a great company, and even if they really feel like their heart is into shaping kids' lives, like what would be the pull when then they would have to take time off to study for the exam, they might not pass it, there might not be folks in their relationship space who are educators who can speak to the power of it. So I was just hypothesizing, like, why would that be the case? And so in many ways, it feels like it is a double-edged sword, right? In many ways, Massachusetts has so much to provide you, right? There's so many great cities you can live. There's so many great things that you can do, but that might be taking a lot of the top talent away from folks who want to take the test to begin with.
That's right. Well, I'm sorry to say that it's 2:58 and we promised that we would end at 3, but that was a really very interesting and thoughtful response. Thank you so much for entertaining my question as well. And I want to now invite everybody. First, thank everybody for participating today and for being here with us. And we want to invite you also to keep in touch and continue to participate. All registrants in this panel will receive a follow-up email with these details, but we want to be explicit about ways that you can take action right now and stay engaged around issues of education and educator diversity. There is a proposed legislation in the House and Senate right now that seeks to make explicit the policies and investments that need to be in place to cultivate and sustain a more diverse workforce. Review that legislation, please, and consider talking about it with your representatives. Number 2 is get your copy of the Teacher Diversity and Student Success books. Anyone who registers is automatically entered to win one of the 5 copies and will be in touch with the lucky winners in the coming days. But by attending, you are also eligible to receive a discount code for purchasing a copy of the book, and you will receive that in a subsequent email. And finally, our Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE, is actively advancing many of the efforts we talked through today and has opportunities for educators to engage alongside them in those efforts. Check out their amazing educators page and consider becoming an Inspired Fellow. You have wonderful examples in the panel today, or become a member of the Principal and Teacher Advisory Cabinets. These are all ways in which you can keep in touch and engage, and we really welcome you and thank you so much for participating today with us. Have a good afternoon, everybody.